Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's event on popular KPIs in PR. My name is Koray Kamgoz. I'm the Director of Communications and Marketing at the PRCA, and we're very pleased today to be joined by two experts in the field of measurement in communications. Before we get started, we'd love this session to be as interactive as possible, so please do feel free to pose any questions using the Q&A box, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen, and we'll work our way through as many of those as we can throughout the session. If you do have any colleagues or friends who'd be interested in watching this back, do ask them to subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you'll receive a notification for when this session is published online, so that we are being recorded for today. I'll kick off by introducing our two panelists today. So to begin with, we have Richard Benson. Richard is the co-founder of Released, a multi-layered tool that showcases the full breadth of modern PR activity in a highly visual format. An expert in digital and social media, Richard began his freelance career consulting and was appointed as head of digital strategy at Launch Group, working across a range of clients, including BP, Disney, and Tesco. 3 years later, he was appointed managing director at Furious, an agency focused on curating digital content and founded by his future Released co-founder, Elliot Jacobs. And in 2012, the duo co-founded Released, enabling PR and social media professionals to present their work in a visually impactful, concise, and digestible format. Richard, it's great to have you with us. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be here, thanks.
And we are very fortunate to be joined also by Steph, who is a communications measurement specialist with nearly 25 years experience advising government departments, major corporations, NGOs, and SMEs using media intelligence. Her virtual agency, Experienced Media Analysts, provides flexible freelance insight teams to media monitoring agencies, evaluation providers, PR agencies, and media relations departments across the world. The flexible freelance team model enables PR agencies to upscale and scale up their in-house analytics capabilities without the commitment of hiring a full-time media data focused employee, something I think we could all benefit from. Steph is a board member at the International Association for the Measurement and Evaluation of Communication, better known as AMEC, and chairs its academic and educators group, co-created AMEC's foundation course in measurement and evaluation, and is a brand ambassador for the Institute of Directors, and is a frequent speaker at HE and FE institutions on the topic of communications measurement. Steph, it's great to have you with us for this session.
Thank you, cheers.
So it probably makes sense for us to kick off with you, Richard. We've obviously have recently published a report looking at popular KPIs in PR, and I know you've spoken at a few events recently, not least the PRCA podcast, in which you kind of shared a few of the key findings. So perhaps just to set the tone of today's discussion, you could share some of the highlights and set the context for the discussion today from that report.
Yeah, of course. I mean, the genesis of the report was really us sitting around asking a few questions that are very common in the industry. So, for example, what are the most popular KPIs in PR? How have things changed over time? How is the industry doing versus the best practice laid out by bodies like AMEC, that Steph is obviously very close to? And we kind of realized that really we were in a quite unique position to answer those questions using real world data, which is not something that we'd seen before. And that's because of the nature of our product specifically. So briefly, Released is used to create integrated PR reports or coverage reports, whatever you want to call them. But a key part of the tool is that our customers are able to create custom bespoke KPIs that literally involve like them adding a number, them describing it, a little icon. And when we looked in our database over the last few years, we realized that over 400,000 of these custom KPIs had been created. And essentially we realized this was kind of a really unique opportunity to lift the lid and see how people are measuring their work when no one else is looking, kind of behind closed doors, when the only recipients would be their clients. or their executives, for example. So yeah, we then went about analysing the data. So again, we looked at, okay, broadly speaking, what are the most popular KPIs? And again, how have they changed over time? And so we split that up. We looked at all of the KPIs created in 2015, and then we looked at all of the KPIs created in 2021, about 6 years later. And then we're quite familiar with AMEC. They have an integrated evaluation framework, which takes people through step-by-step best practice in terms of measurement. And we thought, okay, well, let's divide our KPIs up into those broad categories and see how we're doing overall. And that was kind of the approach that we had.
Right, thanks, Richard. And just before I come on to you, Steph, well, if you had to pick out, I mean, you mentioned, you alluded to the most popular KPIs that people were using. Was there anything in that surprised you, and are there any specific KPIs that perhaps you hadn't anticipated finding?
Yeah, well, I think so there were 3 or 4 of those kind of categories in AMEC's framework that were particularly interesting. So briefly, the first one is activities. So activities is kind of the stuff that goes on before things go live, really. So preparing things, getting things set up in the background, which doesn't sound particularly important, but it was actually the category where there was the biggest change. So in 2015, about 19% of all the reports created included one or more of these activity KPIs. And then when we looked in 2021, the number was 77%, which was a big shift. So a minority of reports historically included these activity KPIs, and a majority now do. And there's different ways of interpreting that. One is it's fairly alarming if you assume that people are now relying on activity-based KPIs to measure their success, but they're not. That's just not true, as we'll see later. What's actually happened is a good thing, is that PR agencies, practitioners, in-house teams are doing much more than they were in 2015. So 2015, it was mostly about media relations, getting coverage. And these days, that's still the most important part of PR's work, but they're doing tons of other stuff. And we see this in conversations with our customers. We see it in reports. So virtually no PRs these days just do media relations and walk away, and that's it. They do social media stuff. They kind of create content. They're managing events a lot of the time. They're doing a lot more strategy. Paid stuff is coming into it a lot more. So handling, which I think is a really good thing, because it just shows that the industry has massively diversified itself.
Yeah, and is maturing, I suppose, is another way of looking at it.
Yeah, it's just it just puts us in good stead for the future. I think it's a healthy way to go.
Absolutely. And Steph, from your point of view, from an AMEC perspective, is that something that you've noticed over the last few years when it comes to measurement, that there's just been broader focus on a wider range of activity?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we think of AMEC's measurement framework, it's actually called an integrated measurement framework, and it sort of speaks to even how my own knowledge has evolved during my time in this industry. You know, before, in the old days, I just used to analyze media coverage, and we're talking about taking it beyond more than just media relations. And I think we're definitely seeing a greater take up of more integrated evaluation, including a wider range of data streams, not just media coverage, but other data streams in relation to, for example, social media data, other stakeholder research, or even internet search behaviors. So there's an awful lot more integration of those kinds of things. And I think it's right, you know, it's just to that piece of more than just media relations. It's important that people are still reporting on their activities, but I think people are now going beyond just reporting the activities and actually taking it beyond just reporting the outputs, the media coverage, but thinking about actually what happened next as a result of this content that was placed out there for the audiences to receive. What was the takeaway that they took from it, the outtake, and the outcomes from it? Were there any, specific downloads of a piece of content, or hits to a website, and so on? So it very much tallies with the data we're seeing coming through AMEC too.
Yeah, and I suppose, I mean, the industry it feels as though it's been quite a long time that people have been aware, or they ought to have been aware of taking a smarter approach to measurement and looking at outcomes and specifically what shifted or what changed as a result of an activity rather than the activity itself. Do you feel like that message is cutting through at the moment, and has there been a kind of meaningful shift towards a more professional approach in recent years?
Yes and no. So the message is definitely getting through. So this is according to the data that we have, but also the conversations that we had on the back of the data. So we did look at outcomes and impacts, and so part of the process was us really trying to get a good understanding of the difference of all these terms, because they can sound quite similar. So our opinion is that an outcome would be something like delivering 50 new leads for your client if you're an agency, and an impact would be, okay, from those leads we actually generated X amount of revenue. So I may be wrong about that, but that's my kind of grasp on the issue. So those are, when all said and done, by far the most important parts of the process. And so we obviously spent quite a lot of time on this to try and find out, okay, how do things stand? And in 2015, when we looked at the reports, I would say a negligible number, almost none, included an outcome or impact KPI. I mean, we really struggled to find them. So the question is, how has that changed? And the answer is, it has changed a bit, but it's not like we've really cracked it. So when we looked at 2021, there's still a relatively low number of reports that included what we would describe as genuine outcomes or impacts. So we split the data in different ways. The most interesting way was when we looked at the types of company that the reports were being shared with. So in other words, okay, I'm creating a report and this is going to a single person, or I'm creating this report and my client is an SME or an enterprise organization. So what we noticed there was that the outcome and impacts KPIs are most prevalent in reports that were shared with SMEs at 16%. So we're talking not much here, but still, when compared with zero, there's a meaningful increase. So we wanted to find out what was going on. And luckily we have a good relationship with our customers. So we basically interviewed the ones where we found reports, and everyone was happy to talk to us. And we asked them, like, what was in place with these particular relationships that you were able to measure these outcomes and impacts? And it turned out there were three kind of pillars that need to be in place for you to do this successfully. And we call them the 3 A's. So it's kind of, awareness is the first one. So all parties have to be really aware of what PR and comms can and cannot do. And this I found to be a really big problem generally. So they're, especially with clients who haven't worked in PR before, often too much time is spent explaining what is and isn't possible. For example, you'll have clients saying, we need to be on the front page of the FT every week. We've all been there. I was there in my agency days. And so a deep breath has to be taken. You have to invest quite a lot of time saying, managing expectations. So, however, if the awareness is good and everyone is crystal clear on what's achievable, you can then move on to the second one, which is aims. Then you have to sit down and actually work out as a team what is realistic in terms of what can be achieved and what can be measured. And then the third one was access. So you have to have access to the right tools and the right teams in order to be able to record it. So if you take a step back, it kind of makes sense that in SMEs, you have the best possible chance of having those three things in place. Good working relationship with your contact and client, who's probably responsible for all of PR within the organization. A good chance of actually them understanding what best practice is and what can be measured. And the best chance of them saying, yeah, I can actually give you access to our Google Analytics, and we'll sit down with our head of sales and we'll start tracking leads in Salesforce, for example, and we'll actually be able to measure, what this PR campaign has achieved. And we can do that by doing things like looking at, normal baseline traffic, for example, or goals within Google Analytics versus when this campaign is running. So I think the other thing that was clear is that everyone we spoke to was had a good understanding of what they should be doing, even the people that weren't doing it. So I think that the will is there, but obviously the way of getting those things in place, you have to be, there is an element of luck in terms of working with the right client where those conditions are met.
Absolutely. So awareness, aims, and access are the key points, and you found that they were most prevalent in small businesses in terms of that that pattern. Steph, does that resonate with what you've seen?
Yeah, totally chimes in terms of, it takes 5 times as long to get access to the Google Analytics in a big corporation than it does in an SME. So it's just a sign of those barriers that come with working with a big multinational, for example. I think there's also something to be said in terms of kind of the timing of when you can gather your outputs or your impact metrics, because and this perhaps might be a reason why it's not showing up in your data specifically, Richard, but it might be happening sort of a bit later on in the process, because often there is a necessity to report on those easier, quicker to get data points, your media coverage, your social media performance. You might need to do that literally in the first few days of the month that's just gone, but it often takes a little bit longer for that content to actually land with the audience and for that those impacts to take place. And so it can often be the case that it takes 6 months or so before the actual evidence of the impacts come through, and so it's just sometimes about the timing of that. Maybe that's why it's not showing through in the data on the release platform per se. Another thought I had as well is in relation to the kind of concept of it takes a generation to change behaviours. And there was a mention earlier, I think there's been a mention earlier on in this recording, and maybe it was in our pre-recording chat of AVEs, and I'm disgusted that we're still talking about it after all this time, but it does, I think we're getting to the tail end of a generation that has been campaigning against the use of AVEs, and we see a lot of trends pointing downwards into the amount of people using that kind of metric. And I think we've got to bear in mind that things such as the integrated framework from AMEC has been in place for just over a decade now, but we're sort of partway through, but we haven't quite reached that generational point yet. So a lot of people come through the system knowing about this good practice, but there perhaps are some leaders, let's say, who are still caught up with the different ways of doing things. And so hopefully in the next 5 to 10 years, this full generation will have passed through the system and we'll be seeing best practice all over the place.
Yeah, and we made it 19 minutes into the webinar without using or referring to AVEs, which is progress in itself, perhaps. Richard, what on AVEs did you find in the report? Was there anything that you could share with everyone on that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we couldn't resist looking into AVEs. They don't fit within the framework, which is a good thing, but we decided to make an exception. So there are a couple of points on this. One is, again, we looked historically and we looked at 2021. In 2015, I think it was 18% of reports included AVE. And in 2021, that number had reduced to 6%, which is, I'd say, a meaningful reduction, but it's still there. So again, we have the benefit of talking to every client that signs up for our platform. We did retrospective interviews around this. So when AVE is mentioned, it's always apologetically. It's never a PR, full throttly believing that it's a fantastic metric. There's always a reason why they're asking, and it's usually our client or our execs are insisting on this, no matter how much I push back. And that's actually reflected in the breakdown of agency versus in-house use of the metric. So about a third of the uses were from agencies, and the other 2/3 were from in-house teams. And I think it's the kind of the senior execs who don't really understand PR, who are like, just give me a number. So that was interesting. And then another trend we've seen is this kind of subtle but dangerous rebranding of AVE. Most people now ask us about PR value, which in the beginning I was like, what do you mean? What is that? And it turns out it's just another name for AVE. So I think whoever's renamed that is very sneaky, because AVE is incredibly easy to pull apart. Advertising value equivalence, you can attack that in many, many ways. And there are articles with over 20 points as to why that it's a ludicrous metric. When someone says PR value, it is a bit it's a bit more dangerous, because you have to then unpack that back to AVE and then unpack that further. So I'm just a bit wary that it will kind of take on a bit of a new life with this new name and survive longer than it should. But if you take a step back and if you look at the conversations we've been having, I think the industry now, if it had its way, would do away with AVE pretty much immediately. It's always third parties that are pushing for it.
Beware of AVEs in disguise is the lesson. And just quickly on the research from your report, was that UK based or was that more international as well?
It's all global.
All global. Because the only reason I ask is because, I mean, we've found very similar research results in our own studies. And I think it was the Eco World Report last year, which showed similar progress on AVEs, but particularly in the UK and a couple of other markets, whereas there were some markets, particularly in the Middle East and elsewhere, that were lagging behind somewhat. Is that what you're seeing as well, Steph?
I'm either recalling that particular report or perhaps similar data coming out from a recent AMEC member survey report. Yeah, there are different kind of zones of the world where their use is perhaps a bit more prevalent. Just building on that article that Richard mentioned before, if you Google something like 22 reasons AVE and AMEC or something like that, you'll probably find an article with these reasons as to why it's not worth it. I mean, as an insider in this industry, knowing how the providers get the data for the AVEs, you know, it was good in the old days when we had print media and before the days of the internet, but that's nearly 20 years ago now. I'm not even saying it was good in the old days, but, you know, there was an element of credible advertising rate data. I think now, given that so much content is online, given that so much media valuation can also include elements such as social media, it's very difficult to actually put a price on that in a credible way. If you think about different brands also, I mean, depending on the size of your brand, who actually pays a rate card for advertising nowadays? And so there are so many caveats as to why an AVE is just sort of based on nonsense in the first place going in and nonsense coming out. So yeah, we just need to put them to bed, I think.
Yeah, I couldn't agree anymore. And I think it's largely symptomatic of a lack of confidence, which I feel the industry is gradually shaking and is becoming more assertive, especially since the pandemic, which we feel has really underlined the true value of public relations and communications and reputation. And just on that, Richard, one of the other things that your report looked at was the impact of the pandemic, what trends, if any, did you find that were accelerated or born about as a result of this incredibly challenging 2-year period which we've all been facing?
Yeah, I mean, there were two really. It was like the volume of reports, how that changed, and also the types of things that people were doing. So initially when it hit, there was a wobble in terms of you know, obviously people were concerned for their welfare and not so much with PR at that point. So there was a slight decrease in reporting, but that actually steadied itself remarkably quickly. I mean, the main thing was really the types of activities that were being offered. So now I think there are a lot more PR agencies who are comfortable offering, you know, webinar services, getting their clients on podcasts, doing, you know, remote virtual events. I'd say that's pretty much exploded to the point where now we work with quite a few agencies who only do podcasts, for example, podcast specialists or webinar specialists. So I think for us, you know, there's the fundamental offerings of the PR industry remain solid and strong, but there was just this slight uptick in virtual services and a lot more confidence in that area as well. Yeah,
all of the things that were kind of beyond our remit, we are now well capable of commanding. And yeah, this kind of event that we're hosting right now is a good example of that. Steph, is that something that you would agree with as well?
Yeah, it chimes with many of the new metrics that a lot of my clients are asking for. And of course, it just speaks to that ability to be able to get some credible digital outcome data, in a lot more metrics in relation to event attendance, report downloads behind gated content, and all that kind of stuff. And I think again, it's that. It's the ability to believe, the numbers might be smaller, however many of us there are on this webinar, that's fine. It's not like we're in the Daily Mail and we're reaching potentially hundreds of thousands of people, but these are actually credible metrics of people that have engaged, that have decided to come to an event and are potentially spending an awful lot of time listening and engaging with the content and therein. So it's much more meaningful content on the part of the clients.
Great, thank you. And before we wrap up, it'd be interesting to get thoughts from both of you on what your I call them predictions / expectations are for the next year. So if we were to look back in, say, a year from now, Richard, I'll start with you, perhaps then move on to Steph. What would you like to see, and what's your prediction for where we'll be when it comes to measuring communications and public relations in a year's time?
Well, we do intend to repeat this report next year, but what I expect is 3 things really. More diversification, so solidifying those new offerings and coming up with new ones, especially in terms of seeing more and more in terms of like PR agencies offering paid search and advertising services and becoming much more comfortable with that. And that's something we're thinking about how to integrate that into our product. The second thing is there's just been this explosion in what I describe as like outtake metrics, which is one of the categories we haven't yet touched on. So outtake metrics are the metrics that indicate that actually the work you've done has started to hit home. So it's just before outcomes and impacts. It's like evidence that people are actually interacting with and engaging with your work. And historically, these have been, like video views or shares of content. But there's been this real explosion in availability, richness, breadth of data that is available for PR people, thanks to services like SimilarWeb and Moz and BuzzSumo, etc. So we've integrated a lot of that into our platform. And so whereas historically, 2015, there was a limited amount we could tell people about how well their activities, how well their coverage is hitting. Now there's just a huge amount. So, we're able to estimate coverage views, where that coverage has been viewed, on the website, in social feeds, within dark social channels like WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger. We can show live social engagement of specific pieces of coverage, which we think is vital because it shows that your story is relevant and hot and getting traction, for example. And then there's other small things like proxies for metrics like sentiment. So sentiment analysis is incredibly hard on small bits of text like coverage, but some of the metrics you can get from social platforms like Facebook reactions, which are little smileys that tell people how you feel about a story, have been really popular because it's real people clicking icons that show how they feel. That's been really popular with consumer clients, for example. And so one trend is we're constantly looking for new sources of metrics. There will be other sources of metrics available which we'll be able to integrate. And so I think that the outtake side of things will really continue to improve. And then the third one is we hope to see improvements in the metrics relating to outcomes and impacts. So that 16% of SMEs, we want to see that higher. We want to see enterprise organizations being more proactive in terms of sharing their data. So that is my prediction in terms of where we'll be in a year or so. Great,
thanks for that, Richard. And just before go over to Steph, you touched on dark social, and that was actually something that jumped out of the report when I was reflecting on it. Could you say a little bit more about that? Because how do you go about measuring the impact of communications that are on channels such as WhatsApp?
Yeah. So first thing I'll say is, as of yesterday, we've just launched another paper. It's like a white paper on dark social. So if you go to release.com, releasd.com/dark-social, we have a free white paper that goes into full detail about what it is, why it's important to PR. But in a nutshell, the easiest way to describe it is by starting off with what open social is, which is the opposite. So platforms like Facebook and Twitter and Reddit have APIs that provide lots of data that tell you how content is being interacted with on their platforms. Dark social is the opposite, so they provide no data, but all of the research says that most content, and by content I actually mean PR content as well, so videos, stories, etc., the bread and butter of PR, are kind of swallowed by dark social platforms. So there's a number of reasons for this. Most people just prefer sharing stories these days with their own private networks of people in WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger, for example. So now the most popular social media platform in the world is WhatsApp, which is a dark social platform. So you might have stories that have seemed to have died that are actually going viral or being really, getting a lot of attention just out of view. So it's really important that PR people understand what dark social is, that it's not scary, that we all use it every day, that most of us on this webinar have used it in the last hour or so.
It's even got a scary name, hasn't it?
It's got a scary name.
I think it's the dark web, but it's not. It's different.
So, so it is, as we sit here, having an impact on the work of almost every PR practitioner in the world, but no one really knows what it is. So the first thing is to demystify it. And the second thing is to look into measurement. So you can't measure it directly, and you never will be able to, by definition, but you can infer things from other data points. So the way we've approached it is we worked with a company called Get Social, who are a dark social tracking company. They gave us about 200 million data points. And we use that to build an algorithm that predicts, based on open social activity, which we do know, how much activity is going on under the surface. And again, it's just a ballpark prediction, but it's important to have these conversations and note that, again, most of the activity is going on out of sight.
That's fascinating. And it's definitely something that all of us, irrespective of our sector or discipline in communications, have to be more aware of. Julie's just asked if we're able to share the report, and what we can do is we can send that around in the follow-up email to everyone immediately after this webinar. So do look out for that, but that report sounds fascinating. Steph, what would you like to see in a year's time in terms of the industry's approach to measurement and evaluation?
Obviously, sort of more of the same in terms of the take up of best practice, using things such as the AMEC framework as your guide as to how to actually plan a campaign before you even implement it, and then how to measure it sort of before, during and after to see what impact it's taken. Really heartened to see the hundreds of people that have already taken the AMEC foundation course in measurement. And I think a code might be sent out with the recording for this session, which allows any member who's listening here today and not an AMEC member, that gives them a discount code for that foundation course. I think with that kind of increased knowledge of better ways to measure comes confidence. And when you have confidence in your numbers, it allows you to tell a better measurement story. So I think that's quite an interesting reflection. Something going strange going on with my sound, I think, here. Can anybody else hear it, or is it just my?
Yeah, I can still hear you.
It's all good stuff.
Fine. And what I'm also interested in, and if you think of PR's often been sort of considered itself as the poor relation to advertising, in the sense that advertising has had in the past supreme confidence in its own measurement numbers. And I don't know why PR has not been as confident in its own numbers so far. But I think there are some interesting trends afoot on the advertising side around possible fraud and misleading advertising data, advertising uptake and so on. And so I think that this could be the year, as we saw during the pandemic, the role of PR versus advertising. I think this could be another way in which PR can continue to try and improve its confidence and demonstrate to the board how effective it can be in terms of the pound spent.
Well, I couldn't agree any more, and I'm completely biased as someone who works in communications for a communications association. But I mean, it does strike me that if the last couple of years have taught us anything, it's the importance of building trust and a two-way relationship in a way that PR and communications professionals are accustomed to doing. It can be a more powerful form of advocacy than traditional advertising. But yeah, we will look forward to seeing how that trend plays out in the next couple of years. Richard, before we sign off, where can people go and find out more about your respective reports?
So we actually have a discount for PRCA members as well. So if you go to released.com, RELEASD.com, you can book a demo, do a free trial of our product, get a discount if you like it. The other tool I'd like to mention, which we're launching very soon, is the cheapest, quickest way to get metrics. So we've taken the metrics from our main reporting tool, Released, and created a separate product called Love Metrics, which is at lovemetrics.co, which for around $5 a month will give you access to all of the metrics that we generate, just from putting in your links to online coverage and social. So that's lovemetrics.co, and you can register for early access there. Great.
Thank you very much, Richard. And Steph, any pointers for where people can find out more about that AMEC and what you've referenced?
Yeah, if you go to the AMEC website, which is amec.org, and I think in the education section there should be a link to the. Actually, there's even here a link in the chat directly to the course. It's hosted on a platform called Thinkific, so you can either access it here from the link in the chat or go to the AMEC website and you'll be able to follow it through from there.
Brilliant. Richard, Steph, thank you both so much for your time. Really appreciate you sharing your insight, and I'm sure our audience did as well. To everyone else watching, as I mentioned at the beginning, this session was recorded, so if you'd like to watch it back or share it with any colleagues, it'll be available on our YouTube channel in the next couple of days. All that's left for me to do is, again, say a big thank you to our guests, Richard and Steph, and we look forward to welcoming you all to a PRCA event very soon. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.